I was measuring flour when the phone rang, the kitchen still carrying that faint chill that settles in Asheville before noon. My name is Marianne Kester, 70 years old last spring, and I've been told I'm the kind of woman who balances her checkbook down to the penny and still writes thank you cards by hand. Maybe that's true. Old habits die harder than people think. The phone buzzed again, Lydia's name flashing across the screen. I smiled before answering, then switched it to speaker so I could keep stirring the pie filling. Her voice was brisk, almost rehearsed. "Mom, you're not invited to Thanksgiving this year until you apologize to Dylan." At first, I thought I'd misheard her. The words landed softly, then rearranged themselves in my head like puzzle pieces forming a bruise. Behind her voice came laughter, clinking plates, the low hum of conversation. They were already at her house, my daughter, her husband, his parents passing around appetizers at a table I'd helped pay for. Apologize for what exactly I managed, for embarrassing him. You were out of line at brunch. Brunch. 3 weeks ago. I'd asked Dylan how his coaching business was doing since I hadn't seen a tax form for the company I'd helped fund. He'd smiled thinly and changed the subject. I heard a muffled voice in the background. "Dylan?" "Probably." And then Lydia's tone hardened. "We just want a peaceful day." "Mom, maybe sit this one out." Something inside me went very still. On the counter beside me lay the grocery receipt from yesterday. The turkey, the cranberries, the bottle of white wine she'd asked me to pick up for the table. My hands trembled just enough to dust the flour onto my apron. "Understood," I said. My own voice surprised me. Calm. Nearly weightless. I turned off the speaker and placed the phone face down. Laughter still carried faintly through the line before it cut to silence. For a long moment, I just stood there. The kitchen too bright, the air too still. Then I slid the pie dish aside and wiped the counter clean, one deliberate stroke at a time. Somewhere between the apology I wouldn't give and the meal I'd already paid for, a new kind of clarity began to settle. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence Lydia had left behind. My screen glowed with rows of transactions, familiar names and dates I'd stopped really seeing long ago. Mortgage payments to Briarwood Bank, automatic transfers to Caro Consulting, the electric bill listed under my name but tied to their address. I scrolled further and found the family phone plan renewal. Even the streaming services were still billed through me. It wasn't malice that kept it going, it was momentum. I had been keeping their life stitched together so long that even the seams felt natural. Across from me, on the sideboard, was a framed photo of Richard, my husband. He was holding a fishing rod. Mid-laugh, the mountain lake glinting behind him. I turned toward him and sighed. "You'd laugh. You know," I murmured. "They still think money appears by magic." The laugh caught in my throat before it could turn bitter. I remembered the day Lydia called, her voice shaking. "The startup's over. Mom, we can't make payroll." I'd wired her enough to keep the lights on, then a little more so Dylan wouldn't feel humiliated. Later came his so-called tax penalty, $4,000 paid just this once. Then the mortgage application. We just need a co-signer for a year, tops. That year became 3. I told myself it was temporary, that parents help their children get started. But somewhere between generosity and guilt, I lost track of where helping ended and enabling began. The cursor blinked at me from the spreadsheet I'd opened to sort the charges. Line after line. It told a story my heart had refused to read. Lydia hadn't outgrown my support. She'd outgrown gratitude. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faint in the dark screen. Love had turned into an invisible ledger, and I was the only one still keeping score. Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the faint smell of rain. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. Saved you a plate porch pickup after 6. No greeting, no apology. Just logistics. I read it twice before setting the phone down beside the mixing bowl still dusted with yesterday's flour. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the heater. I thought about the years I'd hosted, the noise and laughter that filled these same walls. The way Lydia used to stand on a stool beside me, stealing bits of pie crust before dinner. At 6:15, I found myself behind the wheel, headlights cutting through the drizzle as I turned onto her street. Their house glowed with warmth, shadows moving past windows. The faint clink of dishes carried into the sink. I didn't park. I just slowed near the curb. The plate was there. Exactly as promised. Foil wrapped, balanced on the front step, catching droplets from the eaves. A stray dog nosed at the edge, sniffing the scent of turkey and gravy. I watched for a long moment, the wipers squeaking across the glass. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was something quieter, heavier. The realization that a gesture meant as kindness could feel colder than rejection. I put the car in gear and drove on, past the familiar streetlights and into downtown. The neon sign of Ruthie's Diner flickered in the mist. The same place Richard and I used to stop after late drives home. I slid into a booth and ordered coffee and a slice of pecan pie. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, poured the coffee and asked lightly, "Family not cooking tonight?" I smiled back. Careful and small. They had other plans. Steam rose from the mug, curling in the air between us. I took a slow sip and let the warmth settle somewhere deep inside, filling a space that had been empty far longer than I'd admitted. The morning after Thanksgiving. The air smelled of rain and cooling leaves. I woke early, out of habit more than rest, and brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The house was still, the kind of quiet that made even the ticking clock sound intrusive. I carried my mug to the small desk in the corner of the living room where my old accounting laptop sat beneath a thin film of dust. It had been years since I'd opened it, but my fingers still knew the rhythm of the keys. Numbers had always been my language, simple, consistent, mercilessly honest. When the screen blinked awake, I created a folder and named it The Ledger. Inside, I opened 4 spreadsheets: mortgage, utilities, business expenses, phone plan. My cursor hovered for a long moment before I began typing. Each entry came back with a memory. The first line mortgage payment, May 2021. I remembered Lydia's voice, high and panicked. "It's just this once. Mom." The next, Dylan's business tax penalty, followed by another and another. My hands shook at first, then steadied as the pattern emerged: 3 years of small rescues disguised as love. By the time I reached the last entry, the screen was a tapestry of figures that told a story I'd been too loyal to read. I leaned back, feeling something unfamiliar: clarity, not resentment. On the desk beside the laptop lay an old photograph of me and my mentor, Elaine Porter, from my first firm in Raleigh. She'd once told me, "Boundaries aren't punishment, Marianne. They're love with a spine." Back then, I'd thought it sounded clinical, even cold. But now, with the evidence glowing before me, I finally understood. I saved the file and labeled it with the date, as if stamping time on the moment my perspective shifted. The ache in my chest didn't vanish, but it changed shape, less like grief, more like resolve. Outside, rain tapped gently on the window, a steady rhythm against the glass. It sounded, for the first time in a long while, like permission. Monday began like any other coffee: oatmeal, the sound of rain brushing against the gutters. But beneath the calm, a quiet certainty had settled in. The ledger from the night before still glowed in my mind, every number a reminder of how long I'd carried a weight no one had noticed. I started with the bank. After 3 minutes of menu options and 2 transfers, a young representative named Casey answered. Her voice was bright, rehearsed. "How can I help you today, Ms. Kester?" "I'd like to remove myself as the primary payer on a joint mortgage account," I said evenly. Effective immediately. There was a pause the kind people make when they don't quite understand what they're hearing. "Of course. We'll send confirmation once the change is processed." I thanked her, wrote down the reference number, and underlined it twice in my notebook. Next came the credit card extension. Another polite call, another hold tone looping through a symphony of violins. I waited, calm, unhurried. When the operator asked if I was sure about closing the secondary card, I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "I'm sure. It's time for everyone to manage their own balance." By afternoon, I'd drafted 3 short emails, each ending with the same line, effective next billing cycle. I closed the family phone plan, transferring Lydia's and Dylan's numbers to prepaid accounts. The clerk at the cell store looked at me curiously when I declined to list myself as the recovery contact. "They'll handle it," I said, almost gently. The hours passed without drama, just quiet keystrokes and the occasional sigh. Every confirmation email felt like a knot loosening, every click a step away from guilt. As twilight settled, I stood by the window and watched the street lamps blink on one by one. The city moved as it always had, unaware that somewhere inside it, a woman had just untangled herself from her own kindness. For the first time in years, my balance sheets and my conscience felt perfectly aligned. By Thursday morning, my phone looked like an emergency beacon, 25 missed calls, 4 voicemails, and a string of texts blinking across the screen like warning lights. I didn't listen right away. The kettle was whistling, and I poured the water as if nothing in the world had changed. When I finally pressed play, Lydia's voice filled the kitchen, unsteady and high-pitched. "Mom," the mortgage bounced. "Are you trying to ruin us?" "The bank's calling?" "Dylan's furious?" "What did you do?" The next message came softer, pleading. "I just need to know why you'd do this. You could have talked to me first." Then another. "We can fix it. Okay, please call me." Her words ricocheted through the room, echoing off the tiled walls. For a moment, the sound almost cracked something in me almost. But I'd spent too many years mistaking panic for love. I turned off the phone and set it face down on the counter. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. I pulled on my coat and stepped into the neighborhood, the world bright with late autumn sunlight. Leaves gathered in copper piles along the sidewalks, the mountains in the distance veiled by a thin blue haze. Mrs. Hollander, my neighbor from across the street, waved from her porch. "You're out early today." "Marianne, everything all right?" I smiled. "Everything's finally catching up," she chuckled, not understanding, and returned to trimming her chrysanthemums. I kept walking, letting the rhythm of my steps drown out the memory of Lydia's voice. When I returned home, the phone was still buzzing on the counter, vibrating against the wood like something alive. I let it ring until the sound faded into silence. The house felt lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I brewed another cup of tea, opened the window, and listened to the steady hum of the city, steady, indifferent, free. Saturday evening, just as the sun slipped behind the hills, a text from Dylan appeared on my screen. "Please come over. Lydia's not doing well." For a moment, I almost ignored it. But curiosity, or maybe old instinct, pushed me out the door. Their house looked smaller than I remembered, as though worry had drawn its walls inward. The porch light flickered weakly, and a stack of unopened mail leaned against the doorframe. When Dylan opened the door, he looked exhausted, his charm stripped down to raw nerves. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. We didn't know what else to do. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and stress. Unpaid notices and envelopes covered the entry table. Lydia sat at the kitchen counter, her hair unbrushed, scrolling her phone as if it might hold an escape hatch. I placed the binder I'd brought onto the table and unzipped it slowly. The sound filled the room, sharp against the hush. "These are the records," I said. 3 years of payments from your mortgage to your internet bill." Lydia's eyes flicked to the pages. Confusion, giving way to dread. "You kept all this, I did," I replied. "You banned me from Thanksgiving until I apologized. So I stopped paying for the dinner you excluded me from." Her mouth fell open. "You're punishing us." I met her gaze steadily. "No, Lydia, I'm ending a mistake." Dylan rubbed his forehead, muttering something about misunderstandings and temporary setbacks. I turned the binder toward them both. "This isn't revenge, it's clarity. You wanted independence, now you have it." The words hung in the air, heavy but clean. Lydia's voice broke, small and frightened. "We didn't realize it was this much." "You didn't want to realize," I said, softer now. "You just wanted me to keep fixing what you refused to face." Silence spread through the kitchen, stretching like a held breath. I slid the binder closer to her. "Everything you need is here, every login, every instruction. You're adults. Act like it." Then I stood, smoothing the front of my coat. "Take care of yourselves," I said, and walked out before guilt could find a way back in. Fog had rolled in by the time I reached the ridge. The road wound through bare trees, headlights cutting narrow tunnels of light. I drove with the windows cracked, the cold air keeping me awake. My hands were steady on the wheel, my chest oddly light. By the time I reached home, the fog had thickened into a soft veil around the porch lamp. The house greeted me with its usual stillness. No voices, no questions, no obligations waiting to be met. I hung my coat by the door and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. On the counter, my phone vibrated again. Lydia's name glowed on the screen, followed by a flood of messages. "We can talk about this. I didn't mean to hurt you. Please. Mom, we can fix it." I read each one slowly, then placed the phone face down without replying. The temptation to re-enable payments, to smooth things over and restore the old rhythm, flickered through me like muscle memory. It faded just as quickly. I made tea and carried it to the window, watching the fog swirl above the streetlights. Somewhere behind the haze, the city was moving on other dinners, other arguments, other reconciliations. For the first time in years, none of it required my interference. They thought control was love, I whispered to the glass, the reflection of my face pale and calm, and I thought surrender was love. We were both wrong. The tea cooled between my palms as the silence deepened. It wasn't the brittle quiet of being excluded, nor the heavy kind that follows disappointment. This one was different, open, breathable. When I finally turned off the lights and went to bed, the house felt alive again, not with noise, but with room enough for me. By early spring, the fog had lifted from both the hills and my thoughts. The days lengthened, and sunlight began to stretch across the porch in patient gold. I found myself craving company again, not the kind that drained me, but one that gave something back. At the library downtown, a notice board caught my eye. Volunteers needed for financial literacy workshops. Widows and single mothers welcome. I wrote down the number before I could talk myself out of it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a small classroom at the community center, folding handouts and greeting women who carried the same quiet weariness I once did. We talked about budgets, credit limits, and the power of saying no to those who mistake love for obligation. When one of the younger women asked, "Does anyone here actually know what it's like to start over?" I smiled, but didn't raise my hand. My story lived in the examples on the whiteboard, tucked into lessons about accountability and trust. They didn't need names to recognize themselves in it. That evening, I came home and opened the garden shed. The earth smelled damp and alive. From a small paper packet, I poured morning glory seeds into my palm. Tiny, hard, unassuming. I pressed each one into the soil near the fence, whispering the same quiet hope that something tangled could still grow beautiful again. Inside, my phone buzzed once. A single message from Lydia. I didn't realize it was that bad. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then set the phone down without answering. Some things didn't need replies. They needed time. Outside, the wind brushed the garden, carrying the scent of new beginnings and the faint promise of color waiting just beneath the soil. The morning sunlight pooled across the porch, warm and unhurried. A soft breeze moved through the open window, stirring the stack of old recipe cards that lived in a wooden box by my chair. Lydia had written most of them years ago, her crooked child's handwriting labeling each one pumpkin pie, apple butter, Thanksgiving rolls. The edges were worn, smudged with flour and time. I smiled, tracing a faded fingerprint beside the pie recipe. The ache that used to follow her name no longer had sharp corners. It had softened into something quieter, more forgiving. My tea steamed gently beside me as I opened my ledger. Not the old one, but a new binder labeled Home Budget 2025. Every figure was mine alone. Pension, savings, modest donations. A line for community coffee fund. For the first time in decades, the numbers balanced perfectly without anyone else's name attached. Stability had become its own kind of grace. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and morning glories just beginning to bloom along the fence. They'd climbed higher than I expected, curling toward the sunlight like small, stubborn declarations of survival. Inside, the answering machine blinked with a single message. I pressed play. Lydia's voice came through, tentative and low. "Mom, I'm sorry." A breath, a pause, then the soft click of disconnection. I stood there for a long time, hands still, eyes on the garden. I didn't replay it, didn't delete it either. Some words are best left to rest until they're ready to mean what they should. Later, I returned to the porch, tea refreshed, and began sorting through the recipe cards. I tucked pumpkin pie to the top of the stack, an offering to memory, not regret. The breeze lifted the corners again, the paper fluttering like the faint echo of a child's laughter. I closed my eyes, letting the sound blend with the hum of the wind chimes down the street. Love built us. I whispered to no one in particular. Boundaries will keep us standing.